good evening, everyone. I'm very glad to be here. I'm talking about world orders, which ones and how many. Will we wake up tomorrow or in a couple of days' time, if they continue counting for a while, to a new world order? Can the outcome of a particular presidential election, can a single politician even make or significantly influence world order? And I think the answer to this is simply, it depends. And it particularly depends on what someone understands under this term world order. That's very often used, but still to this day very little theorized. But of course, world order is a term that comes with a lot of conceptual baggage associated with it. Talking about world order, let me start by saying what I do and what I cannot do. What I will not do today, talk a lot about international relations as a discipline and the approaches of international relations, because I am of the firm conviction, and this characterizes basically all of my work, that one can understand world politics only if seen in a wider societal context and in a larger historical context. This means, I think, that world order must and can only be understood in a long-term perspective, and if the discipline of international relations is guilty of one thing, is that, and this has to do with the way it evolved, it started, that very often you get the feeling that international politics is something that started in 1945, maybe in 1918 at best, and something happened back there in 1648 in Münster and Osnabrück, granted, but otherwise the study of international relations is not a deep historical discipline. I, however, would argue that world politics and world order do not exist in a world of its own, although, and I will talk about this later a little bit, world politics can and should be seen partly as an autonomous social system with its own rules and ways of functioning. So I'm not talking about classical IR approaches or classical IR theories. World politics needs to be seen in a larger social context. However, that larger social context is not a purely structural context, as some people would have it, who would always argue things need to be seen in the context of the long-term historical evolution of a capitalist world system. I rather prefer what I call a social evolutionary perspective. Why a social evolutionary perspective? Because I think that structural perspectives are notoriously bad on structural change, and evolution can be sudden. It usually isn't, but it can be sudden, and structures condition the likelihoods of developments, but they do no more and no less. So let me start very generally with the question, what are world orders? And this, of course, requires one to think about the two composite terms, parts of the term, namely world and ordering. And then I will move on to argue that world order is embedded in, it depends on and influences the order of the social world in a wider sense. And from this then follows, thirdly, that world order reflects the complexity of this wider social world. And that means, centrally, that it can not be characterized by but one form of order or one underlying ordering principle. And that, again, is something in which much of the discipline of IR is very keen on, to identify one overarching ordering principle, or in the case of IR, non-ordering principle, namely anarchy as the underlying structural condition of world politics. Rather, I think the key to understand the contemporary world order and how that evolved over time and will continue to evolve in the future, regardless of the outcome of any election, is to reflect on how different forms of order coexist how they compete with each other, and how they vary in relative importance to each other. What do I mean by this? Sounds a bit complex. I mean by this that world order is more complex than what I would call the standard narrative about the change of world order. The standard narrative on the change of world order is probably the one that there once was an age of empires. That age of empires, starting with the First World War at the latest, started to dissolve and was superseded by an age of nation states. Nation states, sovereign territorial nation states, being the legitimate form to organize political authority globally. And that then, at least potentially, and at least partially, and at least optimistically, has started to be superseded by an age of internationalism, global governance, supranationalism, you name it. So the heydays of the 1990s, early 2000s, where the idea gained ground that the age of nation states might be superseded by ever denser form of political, regional and global political integration, where ultimately, with the European Union serving as the forerunner, the supranational organization of political authority, superseding the still existing underlying anarchy of power politics. Well, at the latest, since February 2022, some people seem to have realized that, the age of empires might not be completely over after all. My argument is it's not staging a comeback against the age of nation states, so to speak, but that, as I already hinted at, key to understanding world order is that world order has always been characterized by the simultaneous presence of imperial, later on national, and later on supranational ordering principles. So the wrong idea is that these different forms of organizing political authorities in the world supersede each other. They coexist with each other, and the key is in what form do they coexist with each other and compete with each other. Now, generally, and I only want to talk very briefly about this, generally the term world order, of course, can and needs to be seen in a very large historical perspective. Of course, it can and needs to be seen in the context of cosmological ideas, what the world is and how it is ordered. It can and should be seen in the context of the global political economy, of technological and knowledge revolutions. World order, pre-modern forms of world order are certainly very different to modern forms of world order. But this is not what I want to delve into too much today. I want to focus right away on the world orders that characterize world politics. And the three forms that characterize world politics, the three forms of world order, only to repeat, I would argue are imperial, national/territorial/sovereign, and number three, supranational. However, now it gets a bit complicated, but hopefully also a bit more interesting to the sociologists in the room. I would argue that this is not complex enough. This is not complex enough. One does need to reflect that the political system, which is characterized by these different forms of ordering, as much as the society that surrounds it, is characterized by different forms of social differentiation. And the main forms of social differentiation that we know are segmentation, stratification, and functional differentiation. And these are forms of social differentiation which do not only characterize society as a whole, but they also characterize the different forms of political order in world politics in itself. Differentiation also happens within these more particular orders. Now, when I talk about world order, I mean the order of world politics. And what is world politics? This seems kind of innocent question, but that also requires to invest a bit more of thinking about it. My argument is that world politics only comes into existence in the long 19th century. It only comes to existence in the long 19th century when it becomes visible as a distinct realm, a distinct area of the political, where it becomes a specific kind of politics, in a sense functionally differentiated. So as much as you have economic politics and you have whatever health politics and so on, what we witness in the long 19th century is a realm of world politics, where very clearly this is based on an inside-outside distinction, where very clearly it is increasingly based on the idea that it is polities that interact, which is a process that this idea emerges, and on the other hand, the idea disappears that this is about interdynastic, more or less personal relations, where increasingly it becomes observed as a realm that has its own modes of communication, professionalized diplomacy, permanent embassies everywhere, not simply temporary emissaries. And that is something that is only solidified with the Congress of Vienna, where it obtains, so to speak, a generalized mode of describing and observing itself, and that mode is the balance of power. Now, I don't say that all of world politics is balance of power politics. That would be completely wrong. The argument is world politics is politics that is always also observed through this prism of the balance of power. And this is what distinguishes it from other forms of the political. Now, this is a form of social differentiation where world politics is functionally differentiated from other forms of politics. The system of world politics, however, internally also exhibits other forms of differentiation. There is segmentation. That is obviously the way it is organized and structured into various territorial states. There is stratification. There are great powers, medium powers, small powers, and so on. And there's also some degree, contra Kenneth Waltz, of functional differentiation when, for example, global governance regimes are erected that deal with kind of specific problems of world politics. Now, as I said, I would argue that contemporary world order is and continues to be characterized by three large ordering principles, forms of ordering. And the first one is the imperial one. There does exist an order of empires in the world. It never went away. It never went away. It partially went away in a formal sense at the latest with the end of the Second World War. Even the last remnants of empires and their colonies were delegitimized, and we witnessed a long process of decolonization. But if you actually look at the history of decolonization, you will quickly realize that this is not something that happened overnight, nor was it completed a long time ago. Still in the 1970s and the 1980s, you had huge waves of colonization. Think about things like Rhodesia or Belize, countries that only came into existence as ex-colonies quite late in the day. And if you carefully look at today's world map, you will still find, of course, remnants of colonies, more in the form of islands and smaller things rather than big chunks of landmass. But empires continue to exist, and there's certainly continued to exist in what, for better or worse, has always been called informal empire, with huge zones of influence. And also during the Cold War, I think it makes very little sense to describe the United States of America or the Soviet Union as anything but informal empires during that time. And what we have now, and this is, however, the big change over the last couple of years, is a development where I think this strong delegitimization of formal empire comes under pressure again. So informal empires, the logic of informal empire existed all the time. And what we witness over the past 10 to 15 years or so, out of a sudden, is again the idea that this might actually be the legitimate, or this should be the legitimate form of order in the world. We see this very clearly in ideas that the Russian president announces. We see this with some of the ideas that Xi Jinping announces. And what we witness is a process where, how shall I put it, we start to see scratches in the still existing class ceiling of the basis of international law that finds its basis in the sovereign equality of nations and territorial states. No one questions that yet. And all the old or new empires also dress themselves as nation states. What we still do not see is someone standing there in Beijing saying, we are the Chinese empire. Or even in Moscow, no one says we are the Russian empire. So there is still this semantic and legal class ceiling that no one is breaking, but clearly the idea is re-emerging that an imperial world order, a world order of empires, is the way that it should be. With all the special, not only the special rights that empires claim for themselves, but also often associated with a rhetoric and maybe even the honest idea that with this come special responsibilities. But it's the idea that the imperial world order is the way it should be. And this clearly is something else than the other order, what I would call national territorial world order. I mean, it is an order of territorial sovereign states that only with the UN Charter became inextricably linked with the idea of national self-determination. But it is the idea of a national territorial world order. In terms of social differentiation, it's the segmented order. It's basically the order you see if you, I know some people still do that, it's called a book. If you take an atlas, and on the first huge page you have the world physical, and then on the second page you have the world political, the nice colored areas where the entire landmass of the world is divided into sovereign national states. That is the depiction of this national territorial world order. That is primarily a politico-legal order. If you look at the actual assertion of how political authority was organized in world politics, even after World War II, as I said, with decolonization going into the 1970s and 1980s, one could actually say that in this ideal form, fully spread across the globe, this order was only fully realized for a couple of decades. And of course, I think there is very little doubt about this. There can be very little doubt about this. As we know, the equality of these segments was an equality that always only existed in international law. No one would have the idea that in terms of political power, however defined, of economic might, however defined, any kind of equality persists. And this is also very clearly visible in the discourse and the idea that there are great powers, medium states, and small powers in this context. And this order doesn't go away it still obviously exists, but there is also change within that order. So I'm not only talking about the kind of competition and relation between an imperial order and this territorial national order, but there is of course also changes within that national territorial order. As you can clearly see if you look at all the discourses of what the responsibilities and the abilities of so-called Mittelmacht, medium power are or should be, or specialist and specialized discourses about what small states can and should do, and swathes of academics and practitioners trying to cut out specialist thematic niches for some small states, and what they can do and how they can influence international politics and so on. So this order continues to exist, and it is changing. Also still existing, although the discourse is that it's under pressure, is what I would in short term abbreviate as the supranational order. The idea that political authority needs to be organized on a geographically larger regional, say continental scale, or even on a global scale. Maybe not up, no one uses that word in politics very much, not on the scale of a world state, but very clearly above the level of individual sovereign states. And that order still exists. I mean, it might be violated, it might come under pressure, but the UN Charter exists, and human rights regimes exist, and trade regimes exist, and so on and so on. And it is, of course, always has been a partly ideational legal order only, but it's still there. And although much of the discourse about the pressure on the so-called liberal world order actually sees this order as crumbling, and of course it is challenged, particularly by the re-emergence of imperial forms of order. It still does exist. It exists in the form of law, of regulations, of global governance regimes of all kinds, of tons of bureaucrats who actually do that kind of stuff. It's there. Now, the most important thing about all this when thinking about world orders is that I think it would be fundamentally wrong to see these three forms of ordering, imperial, national, territorial, supranational, in terms of a zero-sum game. In a way that there is one world order that can only be organized either this way or that way or that way. And that the historical normal for quite some time has been that all these logics of ordering have been present. And the important question is, of course, how do they relate to each other? As I said, they do not necessarily need to compete with each other. Of course, they can clash, and there are frictions. And this is, of course, rather not so surprising right now. I mean, the overall diagnosis is quite clear. If there is any kind of tectonic shift that we have been witnessing over the past couple of years, is that the first and the second, so the imperial and the territorial national forms of ordering, have started to team up, so to speak, to team up against the third, namely the supranational world order, and that this is the one under most pressure. Now, is any of these kinds of world order intrinsically more peaceful than the other one? I think one could have a very long discussion about this. And intuitively, I would say Of course, everyone would say that abiding by the rule of law globally and organizing political authority on a global scale, less and less influenced by particular national or particular imperial interests, is the most peaceful way to go. I'm not sure whether this holds empirically. This is rather an open question. I would rather say that very much depends on the relation between these forms of ordering, and that one can have quite enduring phases of relative peacefulness and the absence of war, where these forms of ordering coexist in a relatively stable relation to each other, as was most notably the case for most of the so-called Cold War, and that it's the shift in these tectonics, the relation between these orders, when things become really and potentially dangerous. And this is a situation we are now in. We are now in this situation of tectonic shifts, and I would argue that probably in terms of these tectonic shifts, and leave aside the complete unpredictability of Donald Trump as a person, but in terms of these tectonic shifts, things like a single US election might not alter that much. We of course know that, no one has the slightest idea what a President Trump would do in relation to Ukraine and Russia. No one has the slightest idea, save that he says he will end all this in 24 hours, but hasn't bothered to tell anyone how. But otherwise, in terms of also quasi-imperial behavior, in terms of what is done in trade politics and so on, I think there are many similarities to expect from a Harris presidency than from as much as from a Trump presidency. However, meaning these large-scale tectonics I was talking about, they cannot necessarily be easily changed by the outcome of such an election. However, and this is the unsatisfactory part of it, but also the thing that shows that things are and remain open. It could be the case. Now let me come back to what I said in the very beginning, taking an evolutionary perspective. What does an evolutionary perspective mean? It means that what I have been describing in terms of the tectonics of forms of world order is a slowly changing thing. Usually things don't change from one day to the other or from 1 month to the other. You start to see patterns if you start thinking in terms of maybe decades. Then you see trends. But there are ruptures possible. There are evolutionary ruptures possible, and most, apologies for judging by your appearance, but most people in the room do not remember the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Berlin Wall. But those who do will probably very much remember that no one saw it coming. No one saw it coming. And serves as a very stark reminder that such evolutionary ruptures are possible. No one does see, and I think also no one will see, the possibility. There's no chance that anything like this will happen, but no one will see a collapse of the Russian government coming. No one would see regime change in the People's Republic of China coming. And in the latter case, I think this is extremely unlikely for the time being. But these evolutionary ruptures are possible, and they have, so to speak, the potential for speeding up that tectonic shift in the competing forms of order I have been talking about. They also have, we need to be very clear about this, they also have the potential of being very conflictive. and I think it's no secret that the pessimistic view is that in the current situation the world is probably closer to the possibility of a nuclear war or the use of nuclear weapons than ever before. And that would certainly mean a drastic change in world order. There is the possibility of learning. That is part of social evolutionary processes. There is the possibility of collective learning. There is, however, also the possibility of collective unlearning or forgetting. I only say this because I think it's quite dangerous. It's quite dangerous in relation to the current condition of world order to subscribe to this kind of collective downward spiral sense that is rather widespread nowadays. There are many reasons for pessimism, and but I would like to emphasize that there is the possibility of collective systemic learning always there. And I particularly want to emphasize this because of something I mentioned just a minute ago, that we in the social sciences, and I'm talking about international relations, and I'm talking about sociologists or political scientists in general, we are terribly bad in envisaging possible futures. We are very, very much children of the present. And envisaging possible futures is something else than prediction. Yeah? It's not forecasting. We're not talking about forecasting. We're not talking about predictions. If I could do that, I wouldn't be here but in the next lottery place. But envisaging various possible futures. We are very bad at that. We think in the terms of the present, and even when we do make predictions, and even of the so-called hard science kind, such as we look at climate change, we are very often surprised how quickly these predictions turn out not to be true. I mean, thus far every climate change scenario has been overtaken every other year or so, quite drastically and dramatically. But, and this is basically the argument I wanted to make, trying to think about possible futures, envisaging possible futures, which I think is a necessary thing, must not stop still by trying to think about what will the next Trump administration do. It will be horrible, we all know that, and we know that swathes, unlike the last time, swathes of bureaucrats which are in line are already in the waiting and will be in position much quicker. But envisaging possible futures requires to look back, and it requires deep social and historical contextualization. The world order is not collapsing. We see a world order that has always been characterized by this competition of different forms of ordering that I've been describing. And this competition and this coexistence will continue to exist for a while. And again, and this might be a slightly, to stop here, a slightly optimistic outlook, these different forms of world ordering, they are not necessarily a zero-sum game. These different forms of ordering can compete with each other, but seeing an advocacy of imperial forms of ordering the world to be on the rise, which it is, must and should never be an excuse for not trying to work on strengthening supranational forms of authority at the same time, even if there is a President Trump and a Xi Jinping and a Putin. And one can thus at least hope that this might lead to a form of world order which becomes stabler than the one that it is now. Thanks.